there's nothing in here. It's actually full of dust. I'm the world's okayest pastor. Welcome to another episode of Bible Methods. Today we're going to talk about the very first step you should take after you read the Bible verse or passage or chapter. And the very first step you should take when you really want to get into interpretation is ask good questions. The purpose of this step is to know what is going on in the passage. Something that we forget is that we are about 1,000, sometimes even 5,000 years removed from the time that the book of the Bible was written, whether it was like Genesis or Leviticus or maybe even Matthew or Revelation. Each letter, each book, each part of the Bible was written in a different time period, in a different cultural setting, even to a different audience. Therefore, we have to ask really good questions to know what is going on in the passage. We can't get to good meaning and good interpretation and good purpose until we know what is happening, because there's a lot of stuff that the Bible talks about that is very unfamiliar to us. And the reason why it's unfamiliar is because it's a different culture, or there's a lot of things that the Bible says that we don't really know or fully understand. Remember, the Bible is filled with a lot of metaphors, similes, phrases, and idioms. There's a lot of grammatical and literary devices used in which the author assumes that the audience already knows. He doesn't have to explain these metaphors because at that time, these metaphors were kind of understood by that certain culture in that time period. But for many of us in America, we don't really know those same metaphors and similes and kind of cultural assumptions. So you want to ask as many questions as possible. I used to tell my students to dig and dig and dig in the passage for as long as you can and ask as many questions as you can so you can learn everything that's going on, the different characters, the setting, the location, the history, the culture, the government, the lifestyle. There's so much to understand about the Bible that we don't really know. Now, the type of questions you want to ask are who, what, where, when, and sometimes how questions. The reason why how questions are sometimes is because depending on the type of question you ask, the how question kind of gets a little bit more into interpretation and application sometimes. But sometimes it can be helpful. The reason why you don't want to ask why questions is because why questions normally are asking about theological issues or even the meaning and interpretation. Like, why did Jesus do that miracle? Or why did the demon get so scared right here? Or why did Paul tell us to do this? A lot of those type of questions are getting into understanding meaning and interpretation, but we are not ready for that yet. Before we even get into that part, we have to start with questions. Ask good questions. Research the answer to those questions to understand what is going on in the passage. So an illustration I like to use to really understand why asking questions is so important is like a movie with like 6 or 9 parts. So whether you want to take Star Wars or Harry Potter or MCU, even Lord of the Rings, there's 3 movies there, but then remember they did the prequel with The Hobbit and there's another 3 movies there. All those movies are kind of in succession and they each build off one another, but they're all connected. And when we read the Bible, imagine you watching like the 4th or 5th movie in that series. But it gets even deeper than that. What if someone watched the 4th or 5th movie in Star Wars or Harry Potter or MCU and they had no idea what the story was about? They had no idea who the characters are. Maybe they never even heard of Star Wars. So that means they know nothing about the Star Wars universe. Maybe they never knew about MCU or Marvel. They never read comic books, so they don't know anything about mutants and superheroes and Marvel. They don't know anything about wands and Voldemort and all these other characters. Just pretend that that person has no idea about anything that is related to that story or that universe that that movie is set in. And then they watch like the 4th or 5th movie. They would probably be really lost, right? What is that weapon with that light beam that comes out? Why is that green guy so small and talks like this he does? Why is there wands and what are those black spirits coming out of the sky? The person would be probably very lost and confused. And that's why the Bible sometimes gets confusing and boring, because we're kind of coming into it in the middle of a series. We have no idea what that culture, history, what the setting is. We don't really know enough about the characters to understand who they are or why they're important. We don't know what the life is like, the government is like, the kind of pace of life that they go through. We have no idea what the economy is like, the family structure is like. It's very different from our current setting today. And depending on your nationality and your country, it's very, very different. So let's go through some examples. In Judges chapter 7, in the very first verse, it says, "And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley." We read about these countries and these people groups all the time in the Old Testament. They even come up a lot in the New Testament, but there's a lot of names like Midianites and Amorites and Amalekites and all these places like Nineveh and all these locations and countries. Well, have you ever wondered, what is that country all about? Where is that country today? Who are these people? What are they like? It would be a really good question to ask. Who are the Midianites? What are they all about? What are their values? What are the gods that they believe in? Maybe they believe in the one and only true God. What are the other gods that they believe in? Why do they believe in those gods? You see, there's so many questions we can ask. And as you ask one question, hopefully it leads you to ask other questions to understand the character or setting or what is going on in the passage. So in the Old Testament, we read a lot about these people groups, but many times we have no idea who they are. It would be good to know the background of some of these people groups to help us understand a little bit better what is going on in the passage. Later on, when Gideon kind of narrows down the army to 300 in verse 16, it says that he gave them trumpets. Now, in my translation, it says trumpets. You see, when we see the word trumpet in our Bible, we immediately think the musical instrument, like from jazz band or something like that. But in this context, in this cultural setting, the word trumpet wasn't like the musical instrument. In fact, some of your translations might actually say horns or ram horns, right? So it would be a great question to ask. What is the ram horn or the horn or this trumpet here? Was it a real trumpet the way we think about it? It would be good to know what exactly that is. Why is it important, or where did it come from? You see, what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand every single part of the chapter as best as possible so that we can be familiar with its culture and setting, we be familiar with the characters, be familiar with the history, be familiar with the background. Hey, real quick, I just want to interrupt. If you're liking what you're seeing, please hit that like button, hit the notification bell, set it to all. I hope you can subscribe. All these things help the channel so that it could be spread to more and more people. And I hope that you guys can continue to follow along. Okay, let's get back to everything right now. Let's do another example. In Mark chapter 5, after Jesus sleeps on the boat and the storm comes, we arrive at the place called the Gerasenes. Have you ever thought about what is the Gerasenes? What is that country or land all about? Who are those people? Why is it important? Why is it important that Jesus went there? Well, in order for us to get to that part, which is more interpretive, we should understand the people group of the Gerasenes. Who are they? What do they believe in? What's their life like? Do they like Jewish people? Do they like Jesus the Messiah? Do they even know who Jesus the Messiah is? A really good place to practice asking good questions and doing good research and reading up on background is John chapter 4. John chapter 4 has so many references. It has so many different things that are going on there that deals with the culture of that time that we need to understand that, and we can't miss out on that. And John chapter 4 is a very familiar passage to people who grew up in the church. It's the woman at the well and Jesus talking to this woman. But there's so much that I feel like we just read through and we didn't truly grasp the full understanding or the full nature and meaning of what is happening here. John chapter 4 references so many things. It references places like Judea. It references places like Samaria. Samaritans is a very important people group that you and I need to understand because they have a very unique relationship between them and the Jews. There's a lot of historical background in here. In verse 6, it calls it Jacob's well. Well, why does it say Jacob's well? Did Jacob own it? Is there a plaque on there? Is it some other guy named Jacob? Or is it the Jacob from the Old Testament? That's pretty significant. If they call it the well of Jacob, if they call it Jacob's well, you and I need to understand, why do they call it that? Why is this well so significant that they still call it Jacob's well? That relationship between Old Testament and John chapter 4 is important for us to understand. Now, to a person back then who was reading it during the time of when John wrote this gospel, they probably already knew that. They knew the relationship because in that time period, in that setting, they were very familiar with that history. But for you and I today, we're so far removed from that history and setting that we don't really truly understand the significance of that. So look up Jacob's well. What is that all about? And then, of course, there's the character of the woman at the well. Who was she? We know that later on in the passage, it describes her kind of promiscuous lifestyle. Well, why is that so promiscuous? What did the culture of that time think about that type of lifestyle? What was that like for a woman to live that lifestyle? How did people perceive her? It even says in verse 6 that the woman was there at the 6th hour. What is that? 6 a.m., 6 p.m.? What did you think when you saw that, the 6th hour? What time did you think it was? Why do they even call it the 6th hour? You see, the Bible uses language that you and I don't use. Therefore, it's a really good idea to understand that language, to understand these things like the 6th hour and Jacob's well and who are the Samaritans. Because the Bible is trying to tell us something and we're not going to fully grasp that powerful interpretation until we know what's going on in the passage. So ask as many questions as possible. Ask as many questions to understand the culture, setting, and characters of the passage. And when you ask a couple questions, it's probably going to lead you to ask other questions and keep on finding the answers to those questions. Some of you have been asking me what are some good resources to use instead of a study Bible, and I wanted to share one of those resources today. This is not a sponsored video. I bought this with my own money, but one of the books that I wanted to recommend to you is the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Dictionary. This is a very great resource to use, and it acts just like a dictionary. Going back to John 4, you could look up things like Samaria or Samaritan, or maybe Jacob's well, or maybe it's called like the well of Jacob in there. You can look up these phrases, these locations, these people, these words like ram's horn or shofar, and it will tell you what it is, it'll define it, and it'll give you explanations of background in that reference. It's a very excellent tool. I highly recommend that you get it. If you don't have a Bible dictionary or a background dictionary, there's a link in the description down below, so go ahead and check it out. And I hope that that resource will be helpful as you get into Bible interpretation and trying to figure out good Bible study methods. Now, if you're excited about this Bible method and trying to build out this process of studying the Bible, you really want to check out this video right here because I start talking about some mistakes, something that you never want to ask yourself when you study the Bible. This is a very bad question to ask, and you can learn more about that right here.